If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what is the scariest thing that has happened to you in the woods? Camping with some friends on the northern Irish border. Solid night, a few drinks, nice fire, and we turned in late. After 20 minutes of settling down, the fire, which had been well and truly stamped out, starts back up. We can see the glow through the tent walls. Being lazy 15 years olds, we don't go back out and sort it. Another few minutes pass, and we hear some footsteps. One of us calls out, "Who is there?" No response, more footsteps. Twigs crack, and now as they pass close to the tent, whoever is out there brushes the tent wall. We call out again, no response. More footsteps, the number increases, they brush gently against the tent walls more and more. It sounds like 20 or 30 people walking around the tents as quietly as possible, wiping their hands on the tent walls, trying to freak us out. Needless to say, we are pretty terrified. After way too long paralyzed, I crawl out of the tent. Still a dark moonless night with only the smoldering remains of the fire giving off a dull red glow. I see nothing, no one. Hours of broken restless sleep and more of the same terrifying noises. The sun rises. We get out of our tents greeted by the sight of 50 or so sheep. Heavy winds had blown life back into our fire and blown down a section of fence, giving the sheep an escape from a nearby field to our clearing. In the end, I was just glad none of the sheep had caught fire. When I was a teenager, I worked nights part-time at the airport sorting packages for a major US carrier. I worked with my best friend, and since we both lived about 20 miles away from work, we'd carpool. He'd usually meet me at my house and we'd drive down to work. My house at the time was nestled in at the edge of a state forest / heavily wooded area. One night we're coming back about 4 a.m, I park my car, we get out, nothing unusual. Typical woodsy nighttime summer sounds, crickets of birds. All of a sudden we hear a blood-curdling scream like I've never heard before. A woman was definitely in distress or being raped or attacked or something in the woods not far from home. I run inside the house and probably give my parents a heart attack by shouting, "I need the shotgun." Dad jumps out of bed, and by this time he hears the screams as well. Nice cool night, windows open. We load up, grab flashlights, and 45 seconds later are out the back door, sprinting with my buddy towards the sounds. At the edge of the woods we stop and listen. Nothing. No screaming whatsoever. A minute goes by, we walk into the woods, shining our lights all over, walking down the trails, shining lights up into the trees, but we hear nothing again. We call out, we hang around for an additional 15 minutes or so before heading back. It was the oddest, most scary thing that happened while living there. We get back to the house, and Mom had called the sheriff's office, who took our info down and said they'd send a car out. No one ever came that night, but later the next morning, we did get a visit from an old deputy who took our report. The deputy listened, and then suggested it was likely a fox, big cat, bobcat, maybe even a mountain lion. I swear to this day it was a human female screaming for her life. But after searching the nearby woods during the day, we found nothing. No one was reported attacked or missing. A few weeks later, I'm home asleep at night, window open, and wake to my dachshund on my bed staring out the window, shaking uncontrollably. I look over, and there, framed perfectly by the light of the moon, was a large cat on its hind paws peering in the window. I jump out of bed, startling it, and it quietly jumps away. We never saw or heard anything after that. My family moved a few years later. So I guess the deputy was right, it probably was a big cat. But to this day those sounds still haunt me late at night when I'm out camping or spending time near the woods. Walking a trail to an old fort late at night to take Milky Way photos, I began to hear voices. Really, they were unintelligible whispers. Soon one whisper became many, that surrounded me. I felt something tug at my shirt and that was it. I noped the hell out of there. I got back to my car and drove to a brightly lit gas station in the middle of nowhere that felt like a beacon of light and security. Later on in the evening I went to an old cemetery and took photos comfortably for the rest of the evening. I could not focus enough going to the old fort to figure out how to operate my camera, but was completely at ease in the cemetery. Still the weirdest thing that ever happened to me. Still don't know what to make of it. So I was around 11 to 12 and used to spend most days and evenings after school in the forest mountain biking with some friends. It was a time when we had extremely hot summers and near daylight at 9 p.m, so naturally we'd stay super late and session the downhill trails. I lived the furthest away out of all of us at the time, about 6 miles, and would stay late and do some extra runs, as I didn't have anyone to ride home with. One night after everyone made their way out and back home, I decided I was going to do 2 more runs and set off for home. I hit the trail and hauled ass all the way to the bottom and stopped dead on a flat run out at the end. Something primal took over, I had the feeling I was being watched. I whipped off my goggles and helmet and started to push up slowly, thinking I was being paranoid. I got the chills, and started hearing sounds. Footsteps in the dirt, slogging, bushes. I pushed up faster until I hit part of the trail that was separated by an island of trees. I stopped and the noises were close. I looked through the trees and on the other side was a crazed-looking man, fairly dirty and dripping with sweat. He had a claw hammer in his hand and was looking around on the prowl. I suddenly felt paralyzed with pure terror. I picked up my bike so its wheels were off the ground, so he couldn't hear the freewheel ticking sound. And stood there, totally thinking I was about to die. I hear the same thing about 5 feet to my rear and there is a bigger man of similar description, also with a hammer. I stand there, motionless in this 8 feet wide island of trees for what felt like 10 minutes with my downhill bike in my skinny 12-year-old arms. They passed up the trail and I have never moved so fast out of that place. My heart was pounding and I felt sick. I got onto the road into the small rural town I rode through on the way home and sat on a wall shaking. I got home and went to my room and never told anyone. Right, so I was about 13 or 14 when my family decided to go camping. I went off my own to explore. We were in a sort of nature park when suddenly the wind picked up. The tree sounded creaky and it was really eerie. I felt a twinge of dread, like suddenly I was not safe, and that's when I saw them. Graves. Like actual gravestones just in the middle of these woods, and I walked a little closer to get a better look. They were old, like at least 100 years. The gravestones were close to each other but in 2 rows, about a dozen in total. I looked at the dates and they were from 1890s, and the spooky part was that the graves weren't for adults, these were child's graves. Never booked it out of there so fast. Never spoke of it since. I was camping with about 5 of my friends. We set up in the same forest as we would usually and just sat around talking with our flashlights on. One of my friends, I'll call him Kevin, said he quickly needed to go to the gas station. It was quite close to where we set up, so it wasn't that out of the ordinary. Once he had left, after around 2 to 3 minutes, I started hearing a quiet, highish pitched voice saying come here from where Kevin had left. When I asked my friends about it, they said it was most likely Kevin, as his voice wasn't that deep either. But the voice kept getting deeper. Every time it would say come here, it would sound slowed down, like if you slowed down a YouTube video. Eventually one of my other friends, let's call him John, stood up to go check out what it was. Then Kevin came up behind us carrying a couple snacks and drinks. When John turned around and saw Kevin, the voice in an extraordinarily deep pitch said come here. It wasn't Kevin because he was right behind us, so who was it? That was it. We all started booking it for the gas station. We then heard the voice coming closer and leaves crunching behind us. Once we got to the station, we told the cashier to lock the doors. He was reluctant at first, but when he saw a dark figure rushing towards us, he happily obliged. We got some other friends to pick us up, and let's say we never went back to that forest. I used to work at a summer camp in the hill country. After the kids went to sleep, the counselors would go about screwing around and doing the usual stupid things that 18 to 24-year-olds do when minimally supervised and plenty of space to roam. One night, on a full moon, a group of us had taken one of the trucks out to a nearby field to smoke and drink. The field was surrounded by woods, filled with waist-high grass, and had a single road running down the middle of it. We stopped in the exact center of the field and were chilling for about 20 minutes when someone says, "Who is that?" It wasn't a what but a who question, which piqued my interest. I turned around, and at the entrance to the field where we had come from, there's this person just standing there. They were about 100 yards off and it was nighttime, clear with a full moon, so we couldn't make out much detail except that they were wearing light/white clothes and were white. It was super weird. We called to them to come join us, but they just started pacing back and forth in front of the entrance to the field. This went on for a couple of minutes. Well, about 2/3 RDS of the people in the truck/bed of the truck were high and started to work themselves into a stoner's paranoia, so my buddy and I took over the cab and turned the truck around to put the high beams on whomever was over there at the edge of the woods. With the beams out, we could see them pacing back and forth. As soon as we flipped them on, it was just field and woods with road going off straight ahead. Turn the lights off and there the person is pacing back and forth. Lights on, person gone. Lights off, white figure clearly walking back and forth. The people in the back of the truck were losing their fucking minds at this point. I turned to my buddy in the driver's seat and said we have to drive through there to get to the camp. He just says yup. I told everyone in the back to sit down and that we were heading back. One girl starts crying, 2 guys are pulling out pocket knives, terrible idea since they're in the back of a bouncing pickup truck on a dirt road and stoned out of their minds. The last guy just grabs the side of the truck and looks terrified. We turned on the high beams and drove towards the entrance. No figure in sight. We pass into the woods along the road, no figure. Someone from the bed of the truck yells she's still there. After we pass through, we got back to the camp, hid the beer and weed and never went back to that field again. When I told a sanitized version of that story to the campers, they laughed at me. I had never seen anything like that before or since, but I am now convinced I saw a ghost. I don't know what it was about, but I saw it. Since I live in the national forest, work at a summer camp, and go camping often, I have a few creepy stories. However, this one stands out because I was at a family friend's wedding yesterday and this story was brought up. This took place in a camping area near Palomar Mountain in Southern California. I was about 5 years old, and while I don't recall the actual incident, I do vaguely remember the camping trip itself. My family and I were there with an extended group of family friends. One night, my dad, along with some of the other dads and the older kids, went on a night hike, leaving my mom alone at the tent with me. It was fairly late and my mom had gotten me to sleep, so she was trying to get to sleep herself. Only, she kept being woken up by this scraping sound outside the tent. She started to freak out because she was all alone with a small child in the middle of the forest at night. Then she saw the shadow of the hand on the outside of the tent. This was when my mom let out a blood-curdling scream. All the friends that had been on the hike heard it from a distance and came rushing back to the campsite. They started asking her what happened and she tells them. After hearing that someone may have been trying to break into the tent, everyone went searching for anything suspicious around the camp. And what did they find? Dozens of little eyes reflecting in their flashlights. As it turns out, it wasn't a psycho killer that tried to break into the tent that night, it was a curious raccoon. My mom thinks the raccoon hand only looked huge because it was magnified by the moonlight from outside. I used to walk my dog down near the river, along the same path every day, which had a section going through the woods. One day he just passed that section up and walked towards the sidewalk instead. I went along with it, because it was the same amount of time, either way. I happened to glance down the path as we passed it, and saw two figures dart into the woods. I passed people all the time on that path, even after dark like that night, and I never got chilled like that before. Even the really weird stuff didn't really bother me. Something about those guys was different, and I think my dog knew it. He was a good dog. He used to knock me down and stand on me when he heard gunshots and stuff like that. He saved me a lot, but I couldn't save him. He died of a brain tumor when he was 3. I'll probably never have another dog, TBH. He was it. I used to work on a wilderness trail crew way back in the backcountry in southern New Mexico. We saw our share of everything from black bears and rattlesnakes to scorpions and black widows. For one trip, it was just me and one other crew member finishing the last little bit of a through trail. We'd worked as far as possible from either end with bigger crews and just had to fix up the dead middle of the trail. We had a few pack animals with us to carry our tools, and other than that we were alone. 3 days into the 6-day trip, I noticed a deer hanging around our camp. It's not that unusual. The horses have a sort of pellet food we bring out for them and both deer and bears like it, so we have to chase them off every once in a while. What was unusual was this deer wasn't standing near the food. She was on the other edge of camp alone, just standing there. There were no other deer anywhere around, odd for an animal that travels in herds, but again, I didn't think too much of it the first day. And the day after I saw her again. And the third day. She never came near the food at all, nor were there any deer with her ever. She didn't even move very much and was basically always in the same spot. The third day I decided she was kind of creeping me out and I went out to try and shoo her away. Most deer are skittish and run as soon as they see you coming near them. She stood absolutely still, head up, faced my way. And then I saw her eyes. All deer have dark eyes, but hers were solid black and hollowed into her head. They were matte instead of shiny and black goo dripped down the fur below them. I fucking ran back to my camp. She still didn't run, but just sort of shuffled off later. She was still around the next day, but thankfully we were packing out and I didn't have to get near her. Later I realized it was probable she had something like chronic wasting disease or some other problem deer can get, and I'm sure if I hadn't been so startled by the eyes, I would have seen that she was emaciated or had other open lesions, but that scared me so fucking much I thought she was some kind of monster. My crewmate didn't like her either, but only said yeah, there's something wrong with that one. I was walking in the woods behind my house and came across a tiny cleared area with an old shed. I was intrigued because it was in remarkable condition for being in the middle of nowhere with no trail leading to it. On closer inspection I saw that there were garbage bags taped to the windows inside, and the shed was locked with a heavy padlock. I pulled the chain, trying to open it, out of curiosity and stupidity. I decided to walk to the edge of the little clearing and see if I could see anything in the woods on the other side. As I was peering through the trees, out of the corner of my eye I saw something move. I looked up, and there was a camera following my every movement. That is when I realized what I had found was not ruins of an old farm, and I got the hell out of there. I was terrified that I was going to be attacked by some gang that was growing/making whatever, but my dad told me I probably looked like Alice in Wonderland out there and not to worry. It's been over 13 years, so I think he was right. Kind of funny, actually. There's decommissioned train tracks next to a Dunkin' Donuts in my town. It was around 7 p.m. when me and my friend decided to walk down them. It gradually gets darker. Pitch black in a thick forest, with the nearest civilization being the Dunkin' and whatever is all the way down the tracks. We have our flashlights out and it resembles a video game. I was so scared but so excited. We get to a bridge overlooking a lake. The drop is at least 10 feet. We went back in the morning to see it, and it looked like we were staring into the void. We keep walking, joking about how we're gonna get killed when we hear a noise. It sounded like distorted radio chatter just across the bridge. We pause and hear it again, but louder. He grabbed my arm and we just sprinted all the way down. He's talking to me, saying it's okay, we're gonna be okay, there's nothing there, and when we finally reached the end he told me I didn't want to say it while we were in there, but I really thought we were going to die. At one of my cousin's first birthdays, a girl I'd just met and myself decided to go and explore the woods behind my aunt's house. There were little trails, and being the active 7-year-old I was, I wanted to escape the boring conversations of the party and run around the very heavily wooded area. So this girl and I are following this one path, and I'm not really paying attention, until we decide we're bored and hungry. So of course we go to turn around and walk back. We didn't recognize anything. At first, I thought it was just an area we hadn't been paying attention to, but soon I realized we're walking in a circle around this very large tree. At some point we decide to try a branch off of the trail. Down this path, we find a large metal rod, which I thought at the time was very odd. Looking back, I still have absolutely no idea what it was. The best way to describe it is a golden flagpole type rod, and being kids we decide if anything, we should bring it back with us. We start walking with this large rod until we come to this gate I'd never seen before. We look in, and I feel a bit of relief as I recognize the building near it as my aunt's neighbor, and now I have an idea of where we are in relation to her house. However, two things happened. 1. It thundered. 2. We heard cracking nearby. Now, the first thing was a major scare, to me at least, because we're holding this big ass metal rod, and while I now know it's improbable we would have been hurt, I knew that this large rod could draw lightning. But we, 7, and did I mention this other girl was 5-year-olds, were caught mainly by the cracking. It sounded different than the small animals we'd heard while walking about, and the area doesn't have any large predators like bears or wolves. It sounded heavy. The little girl immediately thought we should run toward it, as she thought it was one of our parents who'd come looking for us. I on the other hand couldn't shake that it was bad. I was very paranoid about stranger danger, and even am to this day. I told her that it came from the wrong way. The house was to our left, the sound was far away somewhere right of us. She tried to tell me I was wrong, but then we started to hear it again. It was definitely walking, it wasn't an animal scurrying around. I took her hand, slowly put down the rod, and told her that we'd run on 3. At this point, I think she could tell I was freaking out, cause she didn't make a sound. She was silent. I can't remember if the noise stopped or not. I think I was too focused on not crying or something, but on 3, we bolted. I was basically dragging this child through the woods, and at some point we got back to that big tree, and I realized we still had no idea how to get out. I stopped us for a moment, and that's when I could hear the noises. It was sprinting. In that moment of complete panic, I started screaming. Little fact about me, I'm loud. Even at 7, I was a freakishly loud person. I couldn't hear the noise over my screaming, but for some reason I felt like I scared it. Child logic, and just started down another path. The little girl, bless that child's heart, was sobbing at this point. We were just running because we didn't know what else to do. Then, I heard the most heavenly thing. My older brother. My brother, 10 at the time, was screaming my name. I ran toward his voice. I don't know how, but somehow we got to the clearing that the trails start at. My brother was there, and I saw my mom and a few other adults running up behind him. The second I saw them I started sobbing. The little girl ran to her dad and I collapsed in front of my mom. My mom didn't scold me or anything. I think she could tell I was already really freaked out and was just happy I was okay. My brother on the other hand was very protective for the rest of the party. He was always within a few feet of me, and he kept staring into the woods if we were outside. Funny enough, it's never come up again. My aunt and her family moved out a few years later, but when visiting, my brother would always keep us from going back into that woods, especially me. It's been 15 years, and I still wonder what exactly was in there that day. I also wonder if my brother saw anything. I've always wanted to know, but been too awkward to ask. Who knows? I was in Boy Scouts and went camping with my troop near a lake in the woods. We went camping here every year during the summer for a week. Anyway, on this particular day the weather was pretty crappy, in particular very windy. At first we didn't think much of it until it started getting really dark out in the middle of the afternoon and we started seeing a bunch of funnels start forming in the sky. At first we were kind of fascinated and it started to hail out a bit. But then the wind started picking up and we watched as a funnel start forming and getting bigger and bigger right across the lake from where we were camped, and our adult leaders go into full panic mode. They have us run a little ways down from the campsite to this sort of ditch area. We were all watching as the funnel turned into a tornado on the lake and started making its way toward us. That's when we were like, oh shit. It came pretty close to us but thankfully changed directions, and all we got was really wet from the lake water it was blowing around. We watched it go for a while longer before it went away. So yeah, that was pretty scary. 16 at the time. Was walking just outside the woods in what I thought was a safe area. I had one earbud in. When I walk at night I always make sure to be aware of my surroundings. It was about 3 in the morning. I heard someone catcall me from inside the woods. I glanced around to see no one. I kept walking until I heard someone shout out, "Hey you, get the fuck back here." I turn around just as 3 large men, probably late 30s early 40s, emerged from the woods. I instantly burst into a run, and I don't think I ever ran that fast. They began chasing me and telling me they just wanted to show me something in the woods. I screamed back that I carried knives on me and I wasn't hesitant on killing them if they touched me. I think I had 3 different knives on my person since I never walk in the dark without at least one. They seemed to slow down but still were in pursuit. I ran faster than I have ever ran before. I was nearing my house, so I hopped into my neighbor's backyard before hopping into my own and going in through the back door. I locked every window and door, called the police, and began to cry hysterically. Police show up, take my statement, and then I cried myself to bed. This is the exact reason I refuse to let myself or anyone I care about walk alone at night, and also why I will not ever walk alongside a forest again. This took place around 50 years ago. I used to go into the woods on my own from age 11 when we moved to the area. It wasn't till I was 14 or 15 that I realized how potentially dangerous it was. One day I was walking along the lower path into the woods and saw 2 boys around the same age walking towards me. I knew one of them, but not the other. The second boy touched my arm as we passed and I thought nothing of it. I was only a few feet past them when the boy I knew said something. I should have carried on walking. Instead I turned and tripped due to my ill-fitting shoes, one of which came off. As I recovered my balance, one of the boys retrieved my shoe. I held my hand out for it and found myself in a standoff. I could not go anywhere without my shoe, and the boys refused to return the shoe without some form of sexual favor as a reward. I was frightened to go home with only one shoe. They were ill-fitting because they were hand-me-downs. My mother had told me there was no money for new shoes and I had to make do with a pair of my grandmother's cast-offs. So I sat down on the grass between the lower and upper paths and waited them out. I was there for more than an hour, holding them at bay with words until they eventually left my shoe and walked away. The clincher was when I threatened to tell the mother of the first boy if anything else happened. To be honest, I never thought that anything would happen because of knowing the family of the boy, but that's what all victims think, don't they? I was lucky. As a teenager, me and a few friends would often go on long walks through fields and woodland. We knew the paths through the woodland like the back of our hand. The paths in the wood were flanked on one side by a 1 meter or so fence, as at the top of the first bit of path was an old quarry. The section at the top that separated the woods and old quarry, however, had a few lengths of barbed wire instead of a fence. So on one particular night we were hanging around on the play park near the entrance to the woods. I was getting bored and tried to get the others moving along, but they were pretty hesitant. Eventually they started talking about how they felt something was off about the place. One of them voiced that we should leave. I had a crush on one of my friends at the time, and as an act of bravado I ventured into the woods alone. Hoping they would follow, I carried on for a couple minutes until I was at the crest of the short hill. All the while, my heart was racing. The woods just had an odd aura. I turn around hoping my friends were behind me. Instead I see a silhouette of a man in a wide-brimmed hat. I get creeped out and freeze. He's about 5 meters away on the other side of the fence. I watch him as he walks, seemingly, through a tree and out the other side. He then walks behind a thin tree trunk and vanishes. I legged it down that path and out the woods. Don't think I've ran that fast before or since. This was a weird one with that I almost still don't believe myself about. I am a mountain biker, So I spent a lot of time in the woods riding and also camp a lot, so I am pretty used to being in the woods, even at night alone. In October last year, I was coming off of the dirt road that leads to my favorite trail, which is classified as a double black diamond. For those who don't know, it goes green, blue, black, then double black and finally red diamond trails. Essentially, this is a pretty hard trail, and I wouldn't go near it without proper experience and equipment. There is 3 large gap jumps, as well as huge rock rolls and a pretty sizable drop. Once you turn off the dirt road, there is a long flat trail that goes for maybe half a mile before you reach the downhill. As I turn onto the flat trail, I see another rider up ahead. I like riding with people, so I pedal a little faster to catch up with this person. As I get closer, I realize it's a girl and can make out 3 things. Firstly, no helmet, which is a massive nope, as any fall from a mountain bike without one could leave you with permanent brain damage. Secondly, she is wearing no shoes and a dress, which would render impossible to ride this trail. Third, she isn't even on a mountain bike, she is on an old rusty cruiser that does not look safe. Concerned for her, as she could easily get very injured on this trail, I shout out to her. "Hey! Do you know where you are going? I think you might have took the wrong trail." No response or reaction. I pedal a little faster, and shout, "Hello, miss, are you alright?" As I say that, she goes around a right-hand turn that is about 50 yards away from the first big jump off the track. I catch up and turn around, and see her nowhere. I can't hear her going down, there isn't even entire tracks in the dirt. I took a minute to compose myself and have some water, then I rode down as fast as I could to see if I could catch up to her. Nothing. From the bottom of the downhill, it's about a 20-minute pedal back through low visibility trees, and it was getting dark, and that was the scariest 20 minutes of my life, as used to the woods as I am. I still don't know what I saw, whether my mind made it up, it was a miracle of mountain biking skill to ride with no shoes and a cruiser and a dress, or it was something else. Super weird. I spent a ton of time in the northern British Columbia and Alberta wilderness fly fishing, hiking, mountain biking, etc., etc. I've experienced a lot, but nothing like that time, as my wife and I call it. We were heading for a remote campground in the headwaters reaches of a river basin. Remote as in 150 kilometers down a highway from the nearest town and then 90 km on rough unpaved back road. Remote enough we only saw one other vehicle in a 3-day weekend that is one of the most popular camping weekends of the season. The weather was warm, sunny and clear with not a cloud in the sky. Absolutely beautiful. This particular area has 2 campgrounds about 10 kilometers apart, a north site and a south site. We pulled into the south site first and there was a disturbance in the force. That's the best way to describe it. We had our windows rolled down and were stopped as we had planned to hop out and walk around. The sun seemed to chill and disappear, almost like we were in a shadow despite the sun being almost directly above us, in a clear sky and no trees overhead. The wind stopped. Completely. Not a breath of wind. All the birds and squirrels were silent. I couldn't even hear the river 50 yards away. In short, my sixth sense developed over years of backcountry travel was in full overdrive. Something was wrong. Very wrong.
It was confirmed when my wife turned to me and in a shaky voice and a face draining of color said, I don't like it here.
I didn't either. Something was watching us. I've been stalked by a mountain lion, bluff charged by a black bear and snarled at by a grizzly. I don't get unsettled easily. This was different. I reached behind the seat and pulled my 12-gauge shotgun out, slipping 5 Federal deep penetrator 1-ounce slugs into the magazine and 1 into the chamber, flicking off the safety. I set it on the dash and started turning the truck around. It was then we noticed that none of the sites had been used recently and there was an old burned-out truck camper tucked into the woods. We pulled out of the site and onto the main road. Almost instantly the sun and warmth came back, the birds were chirping, squirrels chattering and the wind was blowing. We drove the 10 kilometers to the other site, and spent a lovely 2 days camped there. On the way home, I pulled back into the creepy site to see if it was a one-off thing. Remember, I'm not spooked easily and trust my instinct. If it had been something like a grizzly triggering my bush sense, he was probably gone. Nope. It was still a bad place. We left and will never go back to that site again. Something truly evil is there. Whether it's current or past, there's evil in that place. If I refuse to get out of a truck, even with a gun literally loaded for bear, there's a problem. It's all verified by the fact that my wife felt the same foreboding and dread at the time. I've never seen her look so scared. I was with my cousin walking down some railroad tracks that led into the woods. We were deep into the woods when a man looking very disheveled came out of the woods with what looked like a machete and started walking towards us. I figured he was just exploring, So I gave him a friendly hello and asked him if he found anything interesting. Without saying a word, Machete Man looked up at me and started walking faster. At this point I was pretty freaked out, but I thought he just had to be a normal dude that wanted to talk to us, so once again I shouted hello there. How's it going? He looked me dead in the eyes and picked up the pace even more. Before he could get too close, my friend and I ran in the opposite direction. Machete Man ran after us for about a minute or two, at which point my friend and I had been at full sprint. I turned around to see if he was still following us, and the guy was gone. We never went back there. I was 17 and I was with a group of friends. We had hiked a couple of miles into the mountains and we were having a bonfire. We were just under a 30-foot cliff and the moon was just starting to peek over the cliff, and I started looking around at the mountains and noticed a weird tall rock. I didn't think anything of it at first, but I started to notice that the rock was shifting a little to our right. I was freaking out and pointed it out to one of my friends, and out of nowhere the thing on the mountain crouches down and seems to be watching us. It doesn't move at all for 5 minutes, but I couldn't take my eyes off of it. All of a sudden it stands up and runs out of sight behind the mountain. At this point all of us had noticed this thing on the mountain and we all were shitting ourselves. We were looking around to see where this thing had gone, and out of nowhere it shows up again, but closer to us right up top the 30-foot cliff. It just crouches down again and watches us a little bit longer, so as we're all freaking out a couple of my friends pulled out their guns and went around the mountain to see what this thing was. And again this thing stands up and we can obviously tell that this thing was huge, probably almost 8 feet tall. So it stands up and jumps down the mountain, landing in a small tree probably 50 feet from us, and runs out into the field out of sight. We packed up and left as fast as we could. It scared us so bad only a couple of us talked about it ever again. Went canoe camping in Vermont on some reservoir. Early in the first day, while trying to find a campsite for the night, we wandered into what looked like a nice area. We noticed a little weird shack which was made out of plywood. Checked it out to find a bunch of rubber gloves, a very stained mattress and other trash. Best case scenario, this was just a weird homeless person's temporary home. Worst case scenario, it was something much more unsettling by more and more of what we saw of it. Needless to say, we got out of there pretty quick and got back on the boat and rowed a bit further down. Found a much less scary place. Until that night, we settled in an area. It said no camping, but we were super tired, so we said whatever, hid the canoe and settled a bit deep into the tree line. This was public land and not private, so it wasn't like we were just staying in someone's backyard. That night we're out at the reservoir checking out the moon, stars, and cleaned ourselves and cooking stuff. As we're relaxing at the shore, we see a light in the distance. We weren't being super quiet because we figured it was just some night fishers or someone doing a similar thing. We slowly realize that the boat is getting closer because it had a dim light. Moments later we have a light shown on us and nobody says, "Hey, what are you doing there?" that you would expect a cop or someone to say in that situation. We get creeped out and head deeper into the tree line, and peek from behind some trees. The light, like a mini spotlight, continues to patrol the forest for another 30+ minutes with only whispers from the boat, or faint sounds of a discussion. We have no clue what to do and start getting really freaked out as they turn off the light and we can hear the boat getting closer to shore, no motor. At this point they had stopped talking to each other, so did we. Eventually, after about an hour of this and a couple of us getting knives out or whatever we could use for self-defense in case these were some sketchy people like what we saw at the shack, we can hear the voices again. They turn a less bright light and hear them moving further away from the shore and heading off in another direction. Was super tense for the rest of the night and I couldn't shake the sketchy coincidences. Odds are it was just people having a similar reaction to us, but I still can't shake the memory and what was actually happening in that section of the woods. Okay, so I used to live in rural Michigan, and my cousin and I, we were best friends at the time, decided to explore the forest behind his house, and we heard gunshots. Now that was normal, people would hunt there, but what wasn't normal were the bullets landing at our feet. And we both are like, what the fuck? And we sprint behind trees, and the bullets stop. We decide to investigate where they came from, and we find a old locked hunting shed, but the thing is that we had been in this part of the woods, and have never seen it before, and the lock was rusted to the lock so I couldn't even move it. My cousin and I looked at each other, and I grabbed a log and broke the lock with one hit. I was 10, 4, 5, 90 pounds, that's how weak and rusted the lock was, and the only thing inside of the shed was a pristine condition DeWalt drill, and a hunting rifle that looked like it had been there since the 1930s, and that's it. To this day, 6 years later, we still think that someone had disturbed a dead guy's old favorite hunting spot, and the ghost was angry and started shooting at us. Hiking at Waterton National Park in Canada. Parked the car and hiked a good 45 minutes or so up one particular trail. This trail had some neat 10 to 15 foot waterfalls, and even if the water flow wasn't high, These were the trail sites. They were nice. We passed families or couples being cute together along the way. Me and my companion decided we'd have a quick break, smoke some weed, and see what the rest of the trail has to offer before turning back to the car. What started as a trail wide enough that 5 people could stand shoulder to shoulder easily, it had narrowed down to a foot trail maybe 6 to 8 inches wide that you could only just walk single file up. About a foot or so to the left was a 10-foot drop into the river, a foot to my right was an climbable incline with thick vegetation. We were coming around a bend in the trail, had about 40 feet of straight path before it disappeared around another bend. It was at that exact moment that 2 adolescent black bears rounded that bend down that path and the lead bear had looked right at us. In what felt like an eternity, but was likely 5 to 10 seconds, we slowly started backing away, and I gave the greatest war cry that would put Gromhell's scream from the Warcraft universe to shame. It did basically nothing. The lead bear kept looking but stopped moving. Its partner walked into its butt, and gave both a little startle. They were focused on each other as we disappeared around the bend, staring at the bears as we did. A few steps backward later after losing line of sight, and it was 5 minutes of running as light-footed as possible before we saw another human. We never saw the mama black bear, but she had to be close, real close. It scared the shit out of both of us, and we spent the 3-hour drive back home basically just periodically yelling bears. During sentences or in moments of silence. When I was 13 to 14 years old, I was invited to a birthday party of a close friend of mine down the street. There were a dozen of us, or something around that, as he had invited close personal friends and a couple of classmates, inside his basement living room, alternating turns on who gets to play Super Smash Melee on the GameCube. As the hours passed, the sweaty gaming by a dozen or so sweaty young teenagers was slowly but surely increasing the temperature of the room, as there was only a single window that was poorly circulating the air inside. We decided to head out for a quick breather to cool down and let the air in the room renew. This story takes place in Norway, a country not particularly known for its high criminality rates and psychomurders, besides the 2011 shootings that happened many years after I was done being a sweaty teenager, so parents tend to be quite fine with letting children and teenagers out into the dark for short periods of time. This is where the wood gets relevant. Behind the house, there was a forest. Now, forests aren't particularly rare at all, and besides stories of trolls and monsters, there wasn't all that much to be afraid of. The house and the forest was separated by a road, a single street light illuminating the pavement/sidewalk closest to the house. We were all gathered outside the back of the house getting some fresh air as one of us spot 2 reflective lights, looking sort of like eyes. After 5 minutes of back and forth speculating as to what it might be and daring each other to go investigate, I rationally thought that it most likely was glass or something of the sort, simply reflecting the dimly lit street light. I walked away from the group, making my way towards the 2 eyes 30 or something yards/meters away. I came to the source and realized it was simply a sheet of clear plastic, picked it up, turned around and announced what it was. That's when something happened. My friends started yelling, loudly, some started running towards the house. As the sheep of a teenager I was, and in my bewildered situation, I ran towards them as I didn't want to be left behind. I got into the hallway of the house where all the others had gathered, as well as my friends' parents, and saw that some of the others were crying. Unclear as to what just happened, I, of course, asked what was going on, what had disturbed everyone so much to the point of tears, something that teenage males are not particularly fond of doing in front of other male friends. Heaving for breath, the birthday kid told me that in the instance where I had turned around, a man, presumably in his mid-40s according to some of the others, had suddenly appeared behind me with his arms reached out in a choking hold. According to the ones that were the last to run back indoors who witnessed when I started to run, he had been inches away by the time I started sprinting back. The police weren't called, as, well, this was a group of teenagers claiming to have seen a man presumably ready to choke me at 2200 hours on a Saturday night, and nothing actually happened. However, I do think back and wonder, was I about to be kidnapped? Was he simply just going to strangle me to death in front of my friends, or was it merely an act of collective imagination getting out of hand after having previously been spooked by reflective plastic? I was walking in a steep creek with my dog looking for arrowheads. This is the type of creek where the banks are so tall and steep it is difficult to get in and out of, and once you are in there your vision is limited on the sides because you cannot see over the banks. It's some pretty remote country and privately owned. After walking for a while I hear what sounds like someone chopping a tree down with an axe, tree knocking sounds. I remember thinking clearly that it made zero sense because of where the sounds were coming from was in a very isolated and deep part of the woods and there was no reason for anyone to be back there chopping down a tree. If someone needed wood there were thousands of other trees that were more accessible and no one uses axes anymore. This is hardwood country, Chainsaws are the norm. I ignored it and kept walking down the creek bed, and then after a few minutes I heard it again. Still didn't think much of it, but I took my walking stick and whacked it against a tree 5 times in response to the tree knocks I heard coming from up the hillside. Mostly just to mess with whomever was up there. It wasn't long before there was another 5 tree knocks in response to me, but this time much, much closer. I started to get a little nervous but wasn't going to let my imagination get the best of me, but I have watched too many Bigfoot shows and know they are said to do tree knocks as a form of communication. I kept going but was much more alert and had this eerie feeling starting to sink in, like I was being watched. Out of nowhere, my dog, who normally stays pretty close to me, put his nose into the air and then took off in a mad dash in the general direction the knocks had been coming from. He scrambled up the bank like a mountain goat and was gone, chasing whatever was up there. Not sure how long, maybe 10 to 15 seconds, my dog, whom isn't afraid of much, came tearing ass back down the bank with his tail tucked between his legs and up and out the other side of the creek in an attempt to put as much distance between himself and whatever he encountered. That was all it took for me. I clawed my way out of the creek in the same direction my dog was retreating and probably set a new land speed record for the 400-meter forest dash. I never did see anything, but I didn't turn around either. I didn't want to see or waste the time looking behind me once I was out of the creek and on level ground. Still makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up to think about it. Oh, finally. Me and my friend were camping about 2 years ago with his parents. Us being the internet addicted 14-year-olds, we were found it really boring, so we decided to go for a walk. It was almost midnight and we were pretty far out in the country, so the nearest town was 45 minutes away. Anyway, me and my buddy were just walking along this dark path talking about school and video games when all of a sudden I heard a loud rustle in the bushes right behind us. I looked over at my friend to make sure I wasn't tripping balls, and he looked at me the same way. We brushed it off thinking it was just a squirrel or something and continued our walk, but even though I thought it was nothing, it still put me on edge, and every minute or so I would just look behind me just to make sure nothing was there. About half an hour along this trail, I turned around to see this guy with a long beard walking behind us. It was pretty dark, but I could make out that he was wearing a light blue plaid shirt and he had something in his hand. I immediately looked at my friend and whispered to him and told him to run, and when I looked back he was chasing us, but he was pretty far behind us. Me and my friend hid behind trees and lost him because it was so dark, and when the coast was clear we both booked it as fast as we could to the campsite. We told his parents what happened, but they didn't believe us. We went home the day after, and a few days later I was eating breakfast while my dad was watching the news, and a mug shot of the same guy, plaid shirt and everything, came up, and apparently cops found him sleeping in his truck with 2 dead bodies in the back. I didn't know what to think except how lucky me and my friend were.